Why Google left China, the hack no one talks about. December 2009. A single engineer at Google notices something impossible. Someone is inside their network. Not stealing credit cards. Not grabbing user data. They're hunting for something far more valuable. The names of Chinese dissidents the US government is secretly watching. This wasn't a hack. This was an act of war. And what Google discovered next would force them to make a decision that would cost them billions and change the internet forever. Picture this. Mountain View, California. Google headquarters. It's a normal Tuesday morning. Engineers are grabbing their third cup of artisanal coffee, sitting in beanbag chairs, brainstorming the next big thing in search algorithms. Everything seems perfect. But deep inside the digital fortress that is Google's network, something is moving. Silently, methodically, like a ghost walking through walls. A senior security engineer named looks at his monitoring dashboard and sees traffic patterns that don't make sense. Connections that shouldn't exist. Data flowing to places it has no business going. His stomach drops. He's been doing this long enough to know what he's looking at. Someone is inside the system. Not just inside. They've been inside for weeks. Maybe months. And here's the terrifying part. They're not where hackers usually go. They're not in the payment systems. They're not scraping user passwords. They're in the surveillance systems. The ones Google built to comply with US law enforcement requests. The systems that track who the government is watching. This is the story of Operation Aurora. The hack that made Google walk away from the world's largest internet market. The hack that exposed a sophisticated cyber warfare campaign targeting dozens of America's most powerful companies. The hack that changed everything we thought we knew about cybersecurity and international espionage. And I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened, who was behind it, and why the implications of this attack are still rippling through the tech industry today. 15 years later. Let me take you back to understand just how sophisticated this attack was. It's mid-December 2009. Google is on top of the world. They're dominating search globally. They've recently entered the Chinese market with Google.cn, making compromises with Chinese censorship requirements that made a lot of people uncomfortable. But hey, access to 1.3 billion potential users was too tempting to resist. The attack likely began months earlier, but the moment of discovery came when a Google security engineer noticed anomalous activity in their internal systems. Now, when I say anomalous activity, I'm not talking about your typical suspicious login attempt or a weird email. I'm talking about sophisticated, persistent access to some of Google's most sensitive internal databases. Here's what made this different from every hack that came before it. The attackers weren't using traditional malware. They were using what's called a zero-day exploit, a vulnerability in software that even the software makers don't know exists. In this case, they exploited a vulnerability in Internet Explorer 6, which was still widely used at the time. But here's the brilliant, terrifying part. They didn't just exploit it randomly. They sent carefully crafted messages to specific Google employees, messages that looked completely legitimate, that when clicked, silently installed sophisticated backdoor access to Google's network. This is what security experts call a spear phishing attack, but that term doesn't do it justice. This was surgical. The attackers knew exactly who to target. They knew the organizational structure. They knew who had access to what systems. This wasn't some kid in a basement. This was a military-grade operation with intelligence backing. Once inside, the attackers moved laterally through Google's network using legitimate credentials they'd harvested. They looked like normal employee activity. They were patient, methodical. They knew exactly what they were looking for. And what they were looking for should terrify you. They went straight for Google's lawful intercept systems, the tools Google had built to comply with US law enforcement and intelligence agency requests. These are the systems that allow the US government to monitor Gmail accounts, search histories, and other data when they have legal authorization to do so. Think about what this means for a second. The attackers weren't interested in stealing Google's search algorithms. They weren't trying to grab millions of credit card numbers. They wanted to know who the US government was watching. They wanted the names of Chinese dissidents, activists, human rights lawyers, people the Chinese government considered threats. This wasn't cybercrime. This was espionage at the highest level. Google's security team started tracing the attack vectors. They brought in some of the best forensic analysts in the world. And the more they dug, the worse it got. The attackers had accessed the Gmail accounts of Chinese human rights activists. They'd compromised source code repositories, the actual code that makes Google products work. They'd established multiple persistent backdoors, meaning even if Google kicked them out one way, they had other ways back in. But here's where the story gets even more intense. Google wasn't alone. As Google's security team investigated, they started sharing information with other tech companies and with US intelligence agencies. And what they discovered was staggering. At least 34 other major American companies had been hit by the same attack campaign. Adobe, Juniper Networks, Rackspace, Yahoo, Symantec, Northrop Grumman, Morgan Stanley, Dow Chemical, the list went on. This wasn't an attack on Google. This was an attack on America's technological and defense infrastructure. The attackers had gone after defense contractors to steal weapons system designs. They'd hit financial institutions to understand US economic positions. They'd compromised chemical companies to steal industrial secrets. And they'd targeted internet companies to identify human rights activists and dissidents. The scope was breathtaking. The sophistication was unprecedented. And the geopolitical implications were explosive. Now, Google had a mystery on its hands. Who was sophisticated enough to pull this off? Who had the resources, the talent, and the motivation to execute such a complex, multi-target operation? The forensic trail led to two Chinese universities, Shanghai Jiao Tong University and Lanxiang Vocational School in Shandong Province. Now, if you're not familiar with Chinese cyber operations, those names might not mean anything to you. But to anyone who studies this stuff, alarm bells immediately started ringing. Lanxiang Vocational School isn't your typical technical college. It's enormous, the largest vocational school in China with over 20,000 students. And here's the interesting part. It has direct connections to the Chinese military. Former students have gone on record describing military-style discipline, and the school has well-documented ties to the People's Liberation Army. Shanghai Jiao Tong University has one of China's most advanced computer science programs, but it's also known to have research labs with close connections to Chinese intelligence services. The forensic evidence showed that the attacks originated from IP addresses associated with these institutions. The attack tools, the techniques, the targets, everything pointed to a state-sponsored operation. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is important to understand. Proving state sponsorship in cyber attacks is incredibly difficult. The Chinese government could always claim these were rogue actors, independent hackers who just happened to be in China. After all, the internet makes attribution challenging. Except the evidence kept piling up. The targets were too strategic. The coordination was too precise. The resources required were too extensive. This wasn't a criminal operation. Criminals go after money, and there was no financial motive here. This wasn't hacktivism. Activists make noise and claim credit. This was silent, patient, and focused on exactly the kind of intelligence that a state actor would want. US intelligence agencies got involved. The NSA started sharing what they knew, which, given Edward Snowden's later revelations, was probably quite a lot. And the picture that emerged was clear. This was the Chinese government, specifically units within the People's Liberation Army, conducting a sophisticated cyber-espionage campaign against the United States. But why Google specifically? Why go after tech companies so aggressively? Here's what the analysts pieced together. China was building what they called the Great Firewall, a massive censorship and surveillance apparatus. But to make it effective, they needed to know what threats existed outside their borders. They needed to identify dissidents before they became problems. They needed to understand how Western surveillance systems worked so they could build better ones. And they needed to send a message. See, Google had entered China in 2006 with Google.cn, agreeing to censor search results according to Chinese government requirements. It was controversial. Google's own employees were divided on whether this compromised their "Don't be evil" motto. But Google justified it by saying that some access to information was better than no access. The Chinese government saw this differently. They saw Google as a potential threat, a Western company that, despite censorship, still represented values of free information and could potentially be used to organize dissent. And they absolutely wanted to know which Chinese citizens were using Google's services to communicate with the outside world, particularly with US government entities. So they didn't just hack Google. They turned Google's own compliance tools, the lawful intercept systems, against them. It's almost poetic in its irony. The tools Google built to comply with democratic government surveillance requests were exploited by an authoritarian government to hunt dissidents. The attackers specifically targeted the Gmail accounts of Chinese human rights activists around the world. They wanted to map the network, who was talking to whom, who was organizing, who was funding pro-democracy movements. Some of these activists later reported being arrested in China, and security researchers believe the Operation Aurora intelligence played a role in those arrests. This wasn't just corporate espionage. People's lives were at stake. So now Google's leadership is sitting in a conference room facing the most consequential decision in the company's history. On one side of the equation, China represents the world's largest internet market. In 2010, there are already 400 million internet users in China, and that number is growing exponentially. Pulling out of China means abandoning billions, literally billions, in potential revenue. It means giving up market share to Baidu and other Chinese competitors. It means admitting failure in one of the most important markets on Earth. On the other side, Google's own surveillance systems have been turned against human rights activists, possibly leading to their imprisonment or worse. The company's source code had been compromised. The attack was ongoing, sophisticated, and state-sponsored. And most importantly, continuing to operate in China under these circumstances meant being complicit in helping an authoritarian government hunt down dissidents. The pressure on Google's leadership, particularly on co-founders Larry Page and Sergey Brin and CEO Eric Schmidt, was immense. There were board members arguing for the pragmatic approach: increase security, patch the vulnerabilities, but stay in the market. The attack happened. It's bad, but it's not a reason to walk away from 1 billion potential customers. There were engineers who were furious that their work had been used to harm activists. The company's values were being tested in the most literal way possible. And there was Sergey Brin himself, who had fled the Soviet Union as a child and had a deep personal understanding of authoritarianism. For him, this wasn't just a business decision. It was deeply personal. But let's talk about the technical response first, because this is fascinating. Google's security team went into full crisis mode. They called it incident response, but that's a dramatic understatement. This was war. They brought in the best forensic specialists, the most experienced security researchers, and began a systematic hunt through their entire network infrastructure. They found multiple layers of compromise. The attackers hadn't just broken in through one door. They'd picked multiple locks and created multiple backdoors. Cleaning this up wasn't a matter of patching one vulnerability. It required essentially rebuilding trust in their entire infrastructure. Google implemented what they called the most significant overhaul of security systems in company history. They completely redesigned their security architecture. They implemented new access controls, new monitoring systems, new encryption protocols. They essentially assumed that any part of their system could be compromised and built from that assumption. They also started sharing threat intelligence more aggressively with other companies and with government agencies. This was actually a turning point in corporate cybersecurity culture. Before Operation Aurora, companies typically kept breaches quiet to avoid embarrassment and legal liability. After Aurora, there was a growing recognition that these weren't isolated incidents. They were coordinated campaigns, and defending against them required information sharing. But the technical response, while necessary, didn't solve the fundamental problem. Google was operating in a country whose government had just conducted an act of cyber warfare against them. In early January 2010, Google made an extraordinary decision. They went public. On January 12, 2010, David Drummond, Google's chief legal officer, published a blog post titled "A New Approach to China." It's worth reading the key paragraph in full because it's one of the most significant corporate statements in internet history. We have decided we are no longer willing to continue censoring our results on Google.cn. And so over the next few weeks, we will be discussing with the Chinese government the basis on which we could operate an unfiltered search engine within the law, if at all. We recognize that this may well mean having to shut down Google.cn and potentially our offices in China. Stop and think about what a bombshell this was. A major American corporation, at the height of its power, publicly accused another government of conducting cyber-espionage against it. They essentially announced they were willing to walk away from the world's largest market on principle. The response was immediate and global. The U.S. government, which had been briefed on the attack, publicly supported Google. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton gave a major speech on internet freedom, directly calling out China's censorship and cyber-espionage programs. This elevated the issue from a corporate problem to a diplomatic crisis. The Chinese government denied involvement, calling the accusations groundless and accusing Google of attempting to impose Western values on China. State media published articles attacking Google as a tool of American imperialism. Other tech companies were caught in an impossible position. They'd been attacked too, but they were less willing to take a public stand. Some, like Yahoo, had already faced criticism for cooperating with Chinese authorities in ways that led to arrests of dissidents. Nobody wanted to be in this spotlight, and Google's own employees were divided. Engineers in China were proud of the work they were doing, bringing information access to millions. They saw themselves as a force for positive change. Now their jobs were on the line because of a decision made in California. For weeks, Google negotiated with Chinese authorities, trying to find a middle ground. But the Chinese government wasn't budging. Censorship was non-negotiable. Operating in China meant complying with Chinese law, which meant censoring results the government deemed sensitive. In March 2010, Google made its final move. They redirected all mainland Chinese traffic from Google.cn to Google.com.hk, their Hong Kong operation. Hong Kong, under one country, two systems, had more freedom, allowing Google to operate without mainland censorship requirements. It was a compromise, but not one that lasted. Chinese authorities blocked access to many Google services. The Great Firewall began systematically disrupting Google searches. Within months, Google's market share in China plummeted. By 2010, Google had effectively left China. Let's go deep into the technical details of how Operation Aurora actually worked, because understanding the sophistication of this attack helps explain why it was so significant. The attack had multiple phases, each more sophisticated than the last. Phase 1. Initial compromise. The attackers began with carefully crafted spear phishing emails. These weren't the clumsy, obvious phishing attempts you're probably familiar with, the Nigerian prince-style emails with terrible grammar. These were professionally crafted messages that appeared to come from trusted colleagues, contained legitimate-looking content, and included links to what appeared to be internal company resources. When a target clicked the link, they were taken to a compromised website that exploited a zero-day vulnerability in Internet Explorer 6. This vulnerability, which Microsoft didn't even know existed, allowed the attackers to execute code on the victim's computer without any additional warning or permission. The exploit was elegant and sophisticated. It leveraged a flaw in how Internet Explorer handled certain data objects, allowing the attackers to break out of the browser's security sandbox and execute arbitrary code on the underlying Windows operating system. Once they had code execution, they installed a backdoor that security researchers later dubbed Hydrack or Aurora. This backdoor was custom-built, highly sophisticated, and designed to be difficult to detect. Phase 2. Lateral movement. Here's where the real sophistication shows. Most hackers, once inside a network, immediately start grabbing whatever valuable data they can find. They're loud, messy, and easy to detect. The Aurora attackers were different. They were patient. They used the initial compromised machines as beachheads. They harvested credentials, usernames, and passwords from infected computers using techniques like memory scraping and keystroke logging. Then they used those legitimate credentials to move laterally through the network, logging into other systems as if they were legitimate employees. This is called living off the land in cybersecurity jargon. Instead of using obviously malicious tools that antivirus software might catch, they used the target company's own administrative tools. They used Windows' built-in remote desktop protocol to move between computers. They used standard file transfer utilities to move data. They blended in with normal network traffic. Google's network is huge and complex, with thousands of engineers accessing systems constantly. The attackers hid in that noise. Phase 3. Privilege escalation. The attackers' ultimate targets weren't accessible with standard employee credentials. They needed administrative access, the highest level of permissions in the system. To get this, they exploited another vulnerability, this time in how Windows handled certain system processes. By carefully manipulating these processes, they could trick the operating system into granting them administrative privileges. With admin access, they could go anywhere, see anything, and modify any data they wanted. Phase 4. Objective-focused targeting. This is where the attack's true nature became clear. The attackers didn't behave like typical cybercriminals. They didn't exfiltrate customer credit card databases. They didn't steal Google's advertising algorithms, which would have been worth billions to competitors. Instead, they went after 3 specific targets. First, they accessed Google's lawful intercept systems, the databases that tracked which Gmail accounts were subject to U.S. government surveillance requests. This gave them a list of people the U.S. government considered interesting, which from an intelligence perspective is incredibly valuable. Second, they compromised source code repositories. Google's actual code base, the millions of lines of code that make up Gmail, Google Search, and other products. This wasn't to steal the code necessarily, but to understand how Google's systems worked, potentially to find vulnerabilities or to build competitive products. Third, and most concerningly, they accessed the Gmail accounts of specific individuals, primarily Chinese human rights activists. They read emails, looked at contact lists, and mapped social networks. The attackers maintained access for weeks, possibly months, patiently gathering intelligence. Phase 5. Covering tracks. When the attackers suspected they'd been discovered, they attempted to erase evidence of their presence. They deleted log files, removed backdoors, and tried to eliminate forensic evidence. But they couldn't erase everything. Google's security team, once alerted, had begun capturing network traffic and system snapshots. The forensic evidence was preserved, allowing investigators to reconstruct the attack. The technical brilliance and the terror. What made Operation Aurora so significant wasn't just that it succeeded. Lots of attacks succeed. What made it significant was the level of sophistication and the clear evidence of state sponsorship. The zero-day exploits alone represented months or years of security research. Finding unknown vulnerabilities in widely used software requires serious resources. The going rate for a good zero-day exploit on the black market is hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions. The custom backdoor malware was professionally developed, with anti-detection features that suggested serious software engineering resources. The operational security, the patience, the careful targeting, the focus on intelligence rather than immediate financial gain, all pointed to a well-funded, well-organized operation with sophisticated intelligence objectives. And perhaps most tellingly, the simultaneous attack on 34 major American companies required coordination, planning, and resources that only a state actor could provide. Independent hackers don't simultaneously attack Google, Adobe, Northrop Grumman, and Morgan Stanley with custom malware. Governments do. Operation Aurora wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern of Chinese cyber-espionage that security researchers had been tracking for years, but that hadn't received mainstream attention. Let me introduce you to the Advanced Persistent Threat, or APT, groups associated with Chinese intelligence services. The term Advanced Persistent Threat was actually coined by the U.S. Air Force to describe exactly this kind of sophisticated, state-sponsored cyber-espionage. Advanced refers to the use of sophisticated techniques and custom malware. Persistent means the attackers maintain long-term access and return repeatedly. Threat indicates they're focused on intelligence gathering and strategic objectives rather than immediate financial gain. Security researchers have identified dozens of APT groups associated with Chinese intelligence, each with their own tools, techniques, and target profiles. They have boring names like APT-1, APT-3, APT-10, but behind each designation is a specific team of hackers working for Chinese military or intelligence units. APT-1, for example, was conclusively linked to Unit 61398 of the People's Liberation Army, a military unit based in Shanghai that specializes in cyber-espionage against English-speaking targets. A security firm called Mandiant published an extraordinary report in 2013 that essentially doxed the entire unit, publishing photos of their headquarters building, names of specific officers, descriptions of their tools and techniques, and evidence of attacks against 141 companies across 20 industries. It was unprecedented. A private company publishing detailed intelligence on a foreign military unit's cyber operations. Operation Aurora fit the pattern of these APT groups perfectly. The techniques, the targets, the persistence, all matched what researchers had observed in previous campaigns. But Aurora was different in scale and impact. It targeted the crown jewels of American technology and defense industries simultaneously. It was brazen, and it forced a response that previous campaigns hadn't. Let's talk about some of the other targets, because each one tells a story about China's strategic interests. Defense contractors. Northrop Grumman, one of the Aurora targets, builds advanced military systems including the F-35 fighter jet, missile defense systems, and classified intelligence platforms. Compromising their networks meant potential access to weapons system designs, classified technologies, and defense strategies. In the years surrounding Aurora, Chinese fighters like the J-20 and J-31 appeared with design elements suspiciously similar to American aircraft. Coincidence? Most intelligence analysts think not. Chemical and industrial companies. Dow Chemical and other industrial firms were targeted for their intellectual property. The product formulas, manufacturing processes, and research data that took decades and billions of dollars to develop. Chinese companies could leapfrog years of research and development by simply stealing the work of American firms. This wasn't just espionage, it was economic warfare. Financial institutions, Morgan Stanley and other banks were targeted not for customer data, but for strategic economic intelligence. What are American firms investing in? What are their strategic plans? What do they know about market movements? This intelligence gives Chinese firms and the Chinese government an information advantage in everything from trade negotiations to market manipulation. Technology companies, Yahoo, Adobe, Symantec, and others were targeted for multiple reasons. Source code theft allows competitors to find vulnerabilities or copy innovations. User data provides intelligence on activists and dissidents. And compromising security companies like Symantec undermines trust in American cybersecurity products. The pattern was clear. China was conducting a systematic campaign to acquire Western technology, identify dissidents, and gain strategic advantage across the economic and military spectrum. And here's the really unsettling part. Operation Aurora was just what got caught. How many other operations were ongoing that companies either hadn't detected or hadn't disclosed? Security researchers estimate that the median time between initial compromise and detection in sophisticated attacks is months or even years. Aurora was discovered relatively quickly, but other operations could have been ongoing for much longer without detection. The scope of Chinese cyber-espionage became a major political issue. The Obama administration began raising it in diplomatic channels. The U.S. Trade Representative started documenting economic losses from intellectual property theft. Intelligence agencies began sharing more information with the private sector about threats. But the attacks continued. Let's talk about something that often gets lost in discussions of cyber warfare: the real human beings whose lives were upended by Operation Aurora. When those Chinese human rights activists' Gmail accounts were compromised, it wasn't just an abstract violation of privacy. It had real, potentially life-threatening consequences. One of the confirmed targets was Ai Weiwei, the famous Chinese artist and activist who has been a persistent critic of Chinese government authoritarianism. While we can't know exactly what intelligence was gathered from his account, we do know that he was subsequently arrested, detained, and beaten by Chinese authorities. Other targets included lawyers representing families of political prisoners, journalists covering corruption and human rights abuses, and organizers of pro-democracy movements. These people lived and worked in the full knowledge that the Chinese government considered them threats. They used encryption, they used pseudonyms, they were careful. But when a state actor compromises the email system itself, bypassing all your operational security because they've hacked the platform you're using, there's no defense. Let me tell you about one case that's been made public. Gao Jisheng is a human rights lawyer who defended Christians, Falun Gong practitioners, and other persecuted groups in China. He was considered one of the most courageous lawyers in the country. His Gmail account was reportedly compromised in the Aurora attack. Shortly after, he was abducted by Chinese security forces, held in an undisclosed location, and tortured. When he was eventually released, he described horrific abuse designed to break him psychologically. He's since disappeared again into Chinese custody. Can we draw a direct line from the Aurora compromise to his detention and torture? Not with certainty, but the timing is suggestive, and the intelligence gathered from his email, his contacts, his plans, his sources, would have been invaluable to the security forces hunting him. This is what makes Aurora more than just a cybersecurity incident. It's a human rights catastrophe. And it wasn't just activists in China who were at risk. Chinese diaspora communities around the world, in America, Europe, Australia, were potentially compromised. These are people who fled China seeking freedom, who thought they were safe, who thought they could speak freely. But if Chinese intelligence services had compromised their email, they could identify everyone these activists were in contact with. They could map entire social networks. And they could use that information to pressure people still in China, family members, old friends, business associates. There's a term for this: transnational repression. It's when authoritarian governments extend their reach beyond their borders to silence critics and suppress dissent. Operation Aurora was a tool of transnational repression on a massive scale. Google employees who worked on the security response have described feeling physically sick when they realized the potential consequences of the breach. These were engineers who'd gone to work thinking they were building cool products, making search better, organizing the world's information. And suddenly they were on the front lines of a conflict between authoritarian surveillance and human rights. Some Google employees in China faced impossible situations. They were talented engineers who'd been proud to work for Google, believing they were making a positive impact by bringing better information access to Chinese users. Now their employer was pulling out of the country, their jobs were disappearing, and they were caught between loyalty to their employer and their own futures in China's tech industry. The Chinese government encouraged this narrative that Google was the aggressor, imposing Western values, abandoning Chinese users who depended on their services. Some Chinese employees believed this. Others understood the ethical complexity but felt abandoned by a decision made thousands of miles away in California. There were no good options. This is the reality of operating in authoritarian contexts. Eventually, you're forced to choose between complicity and withdrawal, and both choices have human costs. Operation Aurora fundamentally changed the geopolitical conversation around cyber warfare and economic espionage. Before Aurora, cyber attacks were generally treated as criminal matters or as intelligence operations that happened in the shadows. Governments didn't publicly acknowledge offensive cyber capabilities. Companies didn't publicly attribute attacks to foreign governments. There was a kind of gentleman's agreement that everyone was spying on everyone else, and we just didn't talk about it openly. Aurora shattered that consensus. When Google went public with the attribution to China, and when the US government supported that attribution, it forced the issue into the open. Suddenly, members of Congress were demanding action. Newspapers were running front-page stories about Chinese cyber-espionage. The issue became impossible to ignore. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton delivered a landmark speech on January 21, 2010, titled Remarks on Internet Freedom. It's worth quoting at length. The freedom of expression and the freedom of access to information have been under siege around the world. Countries have restricted free expression on the internet. And increasingly, their censorship has purpose and sophistication. These actions contravene the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which tells us that all people have the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. With the spread of these restrictive practices, a new information curtain is descending across much of the world. She specifically called out the Aurora attack. We were disappointed in Google's decision years ago to filter its search results in China. But we were also hopeful that the presence of American internet companies would help make the internet in China more open, not less. And we were troubled by the recently reported cyber attacks against Google and other US companies. This was a dramatic escalation. The United States government was essentially accusing China of cyber warfare in a major diplomatic speech. The Chinese government responded with fury, calling it interference in their internal affairs and accusing the US of hypocrisy given NSA surveillance programs. And you know what? They had a point on that last part. When Edward Snowden's revelations came out 3 years later, showing the extent of NSA surveillance both domestically and internationally, including operations targeting Chinese companies and officials, the US moral position became a lot more complicated. But in 2010, The issue was clear. China had conducted a massive cyber-espionage campaign against American companies, and there were no consequences. They'd stolen billions of dollars worth of intellectual property, compromised critical infrastructure, and potentially endangered human lives. And what happened? Diplomatic protests, strongly worded statements, but no real costs. This established a precedent that would embolden not just China, but Russia, Iran, North Korea, and other nations developing cyber warfare capabilities. The message was, you can hack American companies and face minimal consequences. The Obama administration tried various approaches to change this calculus. They imposed some economic sanctions on Chinese military officers linked to cyber-espionage. They negotiated a bilateral agreement with China in 2015, where both countries pledged not to conduct economic espionage via cyber means for commercial advantage. And you know what? It kind of worked for a while. Research by cybersecurity firms showed a measurable decrease in Chinese cyber-espionage activity targeting U.S. companies in the years following that agreement. But it didn't last. By 2018, security researchers were documenting a resurgence of Chinese APT activity. The pattern of massive intellectual property theft resumed. Either the Chinese government felt the agreement no longer applied, or they'd simply gotten better at hiding their operations. The Trump administration took a more confrontational approach, issuing indictments against Chinese intelligence officers, banning Chinese tech companies like Huawei from U.S. telecommunications networks, and implementing broader restrictions on technology transfers to China. The Biden administration has continued many of these policies while also trying to build international coalitions to pressure China on cyber norms. But here's the fundamental problem. There's no international enforcement mechanism for cyber warfare. The United Nations hasn't been able to agree on basic norms for state behavior in cyberspace. Countries like Russia and China argue for cyber sovereignty, the right of each nation to control and monitor its own segment of the internet without interference. Democratic countries argue for a free and open internet with protections for human rights. These are fundamentally incompatible visions, and Operation Aurora exposed that incompatibility in stark terms. One of the most important consequences of Operation Aurora was how it changed corporate cybersecurity. Before Aurora, most companies thought about security primarily in terms of perimeter defense. The model was basically build a firewall, put up defenses at the network boundary, and trust everything inside the network. It was like medieval castle defense. Build big walls and assume you're safe inside. Aurora proved this model was obsolete. The attackers got inside the perimeter, and once inside, they moved freely through the network for weeks. The castle walls didn't matter because the enemy was already inside. This forced a fundamental rethinking of security architecture that's still ongoing today. The new model is called Zero Trust Security. Assume breach, verify everything, trust nothing. Let me explain what this means in practice. Microsegmentation. Instead of treating the entire internal network as trusted, companies now divide their networks into small segments. Each segment has its own access controls. Moving between segments requires authentication and authorization, even for internal traffic. This limits lateral movement. Even if attackers compromise one system, they can't easily jump to other systems. Continuous authentication. In the old model, you authenticated once when you logged in, and then you were trusted until you logged out. In Zero Trust, every access request is authenticated. Every time you try to access a file, open a database, or connect to a server, the system verifies your identity and authorization. Encryption everywhere. Before Aurora, many companies only encrypted data in transit across the internet or at rest on storage devices. Internal network traffic was often unencrypted. Now, best practice is to encrypt everything, all the time. This means even if an attacker captures network traffic, they can't read it without the encryption keys. Enhanced monitoring and anomaly detection. Companies invested heavily in security information and event management (SIEM) systems that collect and analyze logs from across the entire infrastructure. They use machine learning to identify unusual patterns that might indicate an attack. If a user account suddenly starts accessing systems it's never touched before, that triggers an alert. Privileged access management. The Aurora attacker's ability to escalate to administrative privileges was a key part of their success. Modern systems now strictly control and monitor privileged access. Administrative credentials are temporarily issued only when needed, automatically rotate, and are extensively logged. If someone tries to use admin privileges, multiple people get alerted. Google specifically developed a model called Beyond Corp in response to Aurora. The basic idea is that the corporate network is not more trusted than the public internet. Whether you're in the office or working from a coffee shop, you get the same level of authentication and authorization. Access is granted based on device health, user identity, and context, not network location. This was revolutionary, and it's become the template for modern enterprise security. But the technical evolution wasn't just defensive. Aurora also sparked massive investment in offensive security, building capabilities to detect, respond to, and potentially retaliate against cyber attacks. The U.S. Cyber Command, which had been established just months before Aurora, suddenly had a much clearer mission and much more political support. Their budget increased dramatically. They recruited aggressively from the private sector. They developed sophisticated capabilities to counter Chinese, Russian, and other cyber threats. The NSA's Cyber Operations Directorate expanded significantly. While much of this remains classified, we know from various leaks and disclosures that the U.S. has developed extensive capabilities to penetrate foreign networks, disrupt adversary operations, and conduct intelligence gathering. This created a cyber arms race that's still accelerating today. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and increasingly other nations have developed sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities. The market for zero-day exploits has exploded, with both government and private buyers paying millions for unknown vulnerabilities in popular software. There's now a huge gray market of cyber mercenaries, private companies that sell hacking services to governments. Companies like NSO Group, which developed the Pegasus spyware, or Dark Matter in the UAE, or Italian firm Hacking Team. These companies claim to only work with legitimate government customers for lawful purposes, but their tools have been used to target journalists, human rights activists, and political opponents. Operation Aurora helped create this world. It demonstrated the value of cyber capabilities and the relative lack of consequences for using them. It showed that you could steal billions in intellectual property, compromise critical infrastructure, and endanger human lives, and face only diplomatic protests. One of the less discussed but critically important outcomes of Operation Aurora was how it changed corporate culture around information sharing and breach disclosure. Before Aurora, companies that experienced breaches typically kept them secret. The thinking was, why tell anyone if you're not legally required to? It's embarrassing, it might affect stock prices, it could trigger lawsuits. Better to handle it quietly and move on. Google's decision to go public with the Aurora attack was radical in this context. They not only disclosed the breach, but attributed it to a foreign government. They turned a cybersecurity incident into a geopolitical issue. This took courage. Google's leadership knew they'd face criticism. They knew it could hurt their business in China. They knew other companies might resent being put in an uncomfortable position. But they did it anyway, because they believed transparency was necessary. And it changed the conversation. After Aurora, there was growing recognition that these sophisticated attacks weren't isolated incidents affecting individual companies. They were coordinated campaigns affecting entire industries. And defending against coordinated campaigns requires coordinated defense. This led to the development of several information sharing mechanisms. Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, ISACs. These are industry-specific organizations where companies share threat intelligence. There are ISACs for financial services, telecommunications, healthcare, and other critical sectors. Members share information about attacks, indicators of compromise, and defensive techniques. The idea is that if one bank gets hit by a new attack, other banks can quickly update their defenses. Government-private sector partnerships. The Department of Homeland Security established the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, NCCIC, to facilitate information sharing between government and private sector. Intelligence agencies began sharing more threat intelligence with companies. Companies got security clearances for their security staff so they could receive classified briefings. Threat intelligence platforms. Commercial services emerged that aggregate threat data from multiple sources and provide real-time intelligence feeds. Companies like FireEye, CrowdStrike, and Mandiant built businesses around threat intelligence. They track APT groups, document their tools and techniques, and provide early warning of new campaigns. Industry conferences and working groups. The security community became much more collaborative. Conferences like Black Hat, DEF CON, and RSA became venues for sharing technical details about attacks. Working groups within industry associations developed best practices and standards. But this cultural shift wasn't without controversy and challenges. Many companies still prefer to handle breaches quietly. There's enormous pressure from legal departments, PR teams, and executives to minimize disclosure. Even with information sharing frameworks, companies often share information in vague, sanitized ways that aren't particularly useful. There's also the competitive paradox. Companies are competitors in the market but need to cooperate on security. A bank doesn't want to share customer data or business strategies with other banks, but they need to share threat intelligence. Finding the right balance is tricky, and there's the government complication. While public-private partnerships sound great in theory, many companies are uncomfortable with how much access government agencies want to their networks and data. The Snowden revelations showed that agencies like the NSA weren't just defending against foreign threats. They were also conducting massive surveillance on American companies and citizens. How do you share information with agencies that might also be spying on you? Despite these challenges, the post-Aurora world is definitely more collaborative on security than what came before. The recognition that sophisticated nation-state actors require collective defense has stuck. Google specifically became a leader in threat intelligence sharing. Their threat analysis group, TAG, regularly publishes reports on APT activity, zero-day exploits, and state-sponsored campaigns. They've warned about North Korean hackers targeting security researchers, Russian operations against Ukrainian infrastructure, Iranian attacks on dissidents, and ongoing Chinese espionage campaigns. This kind of transparency serves multiple purposes. It helps other companies defend themselves, it puts political pressure on the attacking nations, and it demonstrates Google's security capabilities and commitment to user protection. Other major tech companies have followed suit. Microsoft's Digital Crimes Unit and Threat Intelligence Center publish regular reports. Facebook, now Meta, shares information about influence operations and coordinated inauthentic behavior. Apple has developed advanced security features specifically to counter state-sponsored threats. The industry has collectively become much more mature about security, and Aurora was a key catalyst for that maturation. So where do things stand today, 15 years after Operation Aurora? Google never returned to the Chinese mainland market. Their services remain blocked by the Great Firewall. Chinese users who want to access Google have to use VPNs to bypass censorship, which is technically illegal and increasingly difficult as the Chinese government has cracked down on VPN services. For Google, this has meant leaving enormous amounts of money on the table. China now has over 1 billion internet users. The Chinese digital advertising market is massive. Google's competitors in China, primarily Baidu for search and ByteDance for other services, have built billion-dollar businesses in the space Google vacated. Did Google make the right decision? It depends on what you value. From a pure business perspective, pulling out of China was costly. Google is probably leaving tens of billions of dollars per year on the table by not having access to the Chinese market. From a security perspective, staying in China would have meant continuing to operate in an environment where the government had demonstrated willingness and capability to compromise their systems. It would have required constant vigilance and probably ongoing compromises. From a human rights perspective, the decision looks better. Google didn't want to be complicit in helping an authoritarian government track and suppress dissidents. Whether you agree with that decision depends on your view of engagement versus withdrawal. Is it better to maintain some presence in hope of gradual positive influence, or better to refuse complicity even if it means ceding the space to companies with fewer scruples? The broader question of how tech companies should engage with authoritarian regimes remains unresolved. Apple, for example, has maintained a significant presence in China. They manufacture most of their products there and have a large retail and services business in the Chinese market. But they've had to make compromises, storing Chinese users' data in servers hosted in China and controlled by a Chinese company, removing VPN apps from the Chinese App Store, and complying with censorship requests. Apple argues this is necessary to serve Chinese customers and that some access is better than none. Critics argue Apple is prioritizing profits over principles. Microsoft, LinkedIn, Amazon Web Services, and other tech giants have all made different calculations about how to engage with the Chinese market. Each has faced criticism for their choices. The Chinese government has learned from Aurora too. They've become more sophisticated about controlling foreign tech companies operating in their market. They require data localization, keeping Chinese user data in China, where it's subject to Chinese law. They require source code disclosure for security reviews, which potentially allows them to find vulnerabilities. They've developed their own tech champions and used regulatory pressure to disadvantage foreign competitors. The result is an increasingly bifurcated internet, what some call splinternet. China has its own digital ecosystem largely isolated from the rest of the world. Chinese users use WeChat instead of WhatsApp, Weibo instead of Twitter, Youku instead of YouTube, Alipay instead of PayPal. From a human rights perspective, this is troubling because it makes it easier for the Chinese government to control information and suppress dissent. From a geopolitical perspective, it's concerning because it represents a different model of internet governance, one based on state control rather than openness. From a business perspective, it's frustrating because it fragments the global market and creates separate standards and platforms. And the cyber-espionage continues. While the specific techniques have evolved, the fundamental pattern remains. Chinese APT groups continue to target American companies, defense contractors, and research institutions to steal intellectual property, gather intelligence, and advance Chinese strategic interests. Recent campaigns have targeted COVID-19 vaccine research, 5G telecommunications infrastructure, artificial intelligence and machine learning research, quantum computing developments, biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies, aerospace and defense systems. The tools have gotten more sophisticated. The operational security has improved. But the basic playbook is the same as Aurora: patient, persistent, intelligence-focused operations aimed at advancing Chinese technological and economic development. The U.S. government response has gotten more aggressive. Multiple Chinese intelligence officers and military personnel have been indicted, though they'll never face trial in U.S. courts. Chinese tech companies have been banned from U.S. telecommunications networks. Export controls have been implemented to prevent advanced semiconductor technology from reaching China. But these measures haven't stopped the espionage. They've maybe slowed it down, raised the cost, forced Chinese operators to be more careful. But the fundamental incentives remain. China wants to become the world's technological leader, and stealing Western research is faster and cheaper than developing everything independently. Let's talk about something that often gets overlooked in discussions of sophisticated cyber attacks: the human element. Operation Aurora succeeded not just because of technical sophistication, but because of human factors: social engineering, trust exploitation, and the simple reality that humans make mistakes. The initial compromise came through spear phishing, tricking human beings into clicking on malicious links. The lateral movement exploited legitimate credentials, usernames, and passwords that real employees used every day. The attackers looked like legitimate users because they were using legitimate access methods. This is a fundamental truth of cybersecurity. The human is always the weakest link. You can implement the most sophisticated technical defenses in the world, but if an employee clicks on the wrong link, or uses a weak password, or falls for a social engineering attack, all those technical defenses can be bypassed. This is why modern security programs put enormous emphasis on security awareness training. Companies run phishing simulations, sending fake malicious emails to employees to see who clicks. Those who fall for it get additional training. The goal is to create a security-conscious culture where every employee is part of the defense. But this is really hard. Here's why. Training fatigue. If you constantly bombard employees with security warnings, they start to tune them out. Every system requires a password. Every website wants you to enable two-factor authentication, and every app needs permissions. People develop alert fatigue and start clicking through warnings without reading them. Sophistication of attacks. The Aurora phishing emails weren't obvious fakes. They were carefully crafted to look legitimate, coming from trusted sources with plausible content. Even security-conscious employees can be fooled by sufficiently sophisticated social engineering. Insider threats. Sometimes the human element isn't about being tricked, it's about deliberate betrayal. Employees who are disgruntled, financially motivated, or ideologically aligned with adversaries can become insider threats. Edward Snowden was an insider threat to the NSA. Chelsea Manning was an insider threat to the military. Companies face similar risks. Supply chain complexity. Modern businesses rely on thousands of vendors, contractors, and service providers. Each one is a potential entry point. If an attacker can't directly compromise your company, they might compromise one of your vendors and use that as a stepping stone. This is how the Target breach happened in 2013. Attackers compromised an HVAC vendor that had access to Target's network. The solution isn't purely technical, and it isn't purely training. It's about creating a security culture where employees understand why security matters and feel empowered to report suspicious activity without fear of being punished for making mistakes. Security teams are seen as enablers rather than obstacles. There's a balance between security and usability. If security measures are too onerous, people will find ways around them. Leadership demonstrates commitment to security, both through resource allocation and personal behavior. Google, post-Aurora, became fanatical about security culture. They implemented hardware security keys for all employees, physical devices required for authentication that are virtually impossible to phish. They built extensive internal training programs. They encouraged security researchers to find vulnerabilities through bug bounty programs. They made security a core part of every engineer's job, not just the responsibility of a separate security team. Other companies have tried to follow suit, with varying degrees of success. The challenge is that security often feels like it slows things down. Engineers want to ship features quickly. Salespeople want to close deals. Executives want to hit growth targets. Security requirements can feel like obstacles to these goals. Finding the right balance, being secure enough to protect against serious threats without being so locked down that the business can't function, is an ongoing challenge. And there's a deeper philosophical question here. Can we really expect individual employees to be the last line of defense against nation-state attackers with virtually unlimited resources? When a Chinese military unit with hundreds of trained hackers, custom malware, and zero-day exploits targets your company, is it fair to blame the employee who clicked a sophisticated phishing email? Or is that a systemic failure that requires systemic solutions? I'd argue it's both. Yes, we need to train employees and create security awareness. But we also need technical defenses that don't rely entirely on humans never making mistakes, because humans will always make mistakes. This is the principle behind defense in depth, multiple layers of security so that no single failure is catastrophic. If someone clicks a phishing link, endpoint detection should catch the malware. If malware is installed, network segmentation should limit its spread. If attackers move laterally, anomaly detection should notice unusual behavior. If they access sensitive data, data loss prevention should trigger alerts. No single defense is perfect, but multiple imperfect defenses, layered together, can be highly effective. Operation Aurora's use of a zero-day exploit in Internet Explorer highlights another troubling aspect of modern cybersecurity: the commercial market for vulnerabilities. A zero-day vulnerability is a flaw in software that the vendor doesn't know about and therefore hasn't patched. The term zero-day refers to the fact that developers have had 0 days to fix it. It's unknown to them. These vulnerabilities are extraordinarily valuable. Here's why. If you discover a 0-day in a widely used piece of software, say Windows, iOS, Chrome, or Android, you have multiple options for what to do with it. Option 1. Responsible disclosure. You could report it to the vendor through their bug bounty program. They'll fix it and probably pay you a reward. For a serious vulnerability, this might be $10,000 to $100,000, sometimes more. This is the good guy option. Option 2. Sell it to a government. Intelligence agencies and military cyber units will pay much more than bug bounties for 0 days. They want them for offensive operations, to hack into targets' devices and networks. The going rate for a good iOS 0-day is reportedly $1 to $2 million. For something that allows remote code execution on Windows, maybe $500,000 to $1 million. Option 3. Sell it to a broker or cyber mercenary company. There are companies like Zerodium, CrowdStrike, and others that act as intermediaries between vulnerability researchers and government buyers. They publish price lists. We'll pay $2.5 million for an iOS 0-day that works without user interaction, $2 million for Android, $1.5 million for Windows, etc. Option 4. Use it yourself for criminal purposes, deploying ransomware, stealing financial data, or conducting corporate espionage. This is the black hat option. Option 5. Sit on it and do nothing, which is what happens if you discover a vulnerability and aren't interested in any of the above options. The vulnerability remains unknown and unpatched indefinitely. This creates a perverse economic ecosystem. The fact that governments will pay millions for vulnerabilities creates an incentive for talented security researchers to hoard vulnerabilities rather than helping fix them. It means that serious flaws in widely used software remain unpatched while someone makes money selling them. The Aurora attackers used a 0-day in Internet Explorer 6. Microsoft didn't know about this vulnerability until Aurora was discovered. Someone, probably Chinese government hackers or contractors working for them, had discovered this vulnerability and weaponized it. Did they discover it themselves through their own research? Possibly. China has extensive cyber warfare research programs at military-affiliated universities and research institutes. Did they buy it from a broker or mercenary company? Also possible. The zero-day market is global and not particularly discriminating about who the end customers are. Did they steal it from someone else who discovered it? This also happens. Intelligence agencies sometimes hack other intelligence agencies specifically to steal their hacking tools and zero days. We don't know the specific provenance of the Aurora zero day, but its existence highlights the market dynamics at play. The US government has struggled with how to approach this. On one hand, they're major buyers in the zero-day market. The NSA, CIA, and Cyber Command need 0 days for their offensive operations. On the other hand, these same vulnerabilities put American companies and citizens at risk when adversaries use them. The government developed a Vulnerabilities Equities Process, VP, that's supposed to balance these concerns. When intelligence agencies discover or acquire 0 days, the VP is supposed to evaluate whether to disclose them to vendors so they can be fixed, or retain them for intelligence use. The process is supposed to default toward disclosure unless there's a compelling national security reason to keep the vulnerability secret. But the process is classified, and we have no visibility into how it actually works in practice. How many vulnerabilities are disclosed versus retained? What criteria are used? Who makes the decisions? From Edward Snowden's leaks and other disclosures, we know the NSA maintained large stockpiles of 0 days. One leak revealed they had a catalog of exploits and hacking tools for virtually every major platform and device. When that catalog leaked to criminal groups, we saw a wave of attacks using former intelligence agency tools. The WannaCry ransomware attack in 2017, which caused billions in damage worldwide and crippled Britain's National Health Service, used an exploit called Eternal Blue that was developed by the NSA and stolen by hackers. The NSA had known about the Windows vulnerability for years, but kept it secret to use for their own operations. When it leaked, criminals weaponized it for ransom. This is the fundamental dilemma of the zero-day market. Vulnerabilities are valuable for both offense and defense, but you can't keep them secret for offensive use while also protecting your own systems. The same vulnerabilities that let you hack adversaries also let adversaries hack you. Some security researchers and policy advocates have called for governments to stop participating in the zero-day market and instead disclose all discovered vulnerabilities to vendors. The argument is that making software more secure benefits everyone, including government agencies whose operations depend on that software. Others argue this is naive. Adversaries will continue buying and using 0 days regardless of what the US does. So unilateral disarmament just handicaps American intelligence agencies without making anyone more secure. It's a genuine policy dilemma with no easy answers. What's clear is that the Aurora attack demonstrated the destructive potential of 0 days in the hands of sophisticated adversaries. It's a problem that's only gotten worse in the 15 years since. Operation Aurora forced a broader reckoning about technology policy issues that we're still wrestling with today. Encryption and backdoors. One of the key debates that emerged post-Aurora was about encryption. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies argued they needed lawful access to encrypted communications, essentially backdoors that would allow them to access encrypted data with proper legal authorization. Tech companies, particularly after Aurora, became deeply skeptical of this idea. If you build a backdoor for legitimate government access, that backdoor can be exploited by adversaries. The Aurora attackers went straight for Google's lawful intercept systems, the tools built for legitimate government access, and used them for espionage. This convinced many in the tech industry that building any form of backdoor access is fundamentally dangerous. Apple famously fought the FBI in 2016 when the Bureau demanded they create a way to unlock an iPhone used by a terrorist. Apple refused, arguing that creating such a capability would undermine security for all iPhone users. The government's position is that without lawful access capabilities, criminals and terrorists can communicate in ways that are impossible to intercept even with valid warrants. Tech companies' position is that security vulnerabilities, even ones intended for legitimate use, will inevitably be exploited by adversaries. Aurora provided a powerful case study supporting the tech company's position. They built lawful access systems as required by law, and those systems were immediately targeted by Chinese intelligence. Supply chain security. Aurora also highlighted the vulnerability of complex technology supply chains. Modern devices and software are assembled from components and code from dozens or hundreds of different sources. Each link in that chain is a potential vulnerability. This concern became much more prominent after Aurora. The U.S. government started scrutinizing Chinese telecommunications equipment from companies like Huawei and ZTE, concerned that hardware or software backdoors might be embedded. Eventually, they banned these companies from U.S. telecommunications networks. The irony is that U.S. intelligence agencies have themselves engaged in supply chain interdiction, intercepting devices in transit and implanting surveillance capabilities before they reach customers. Edward Snowden revealed NSA programs that did exactly this. So we have a situation where everyone is worried about everyone else's supply chains, and everyone is probably trying to compromise everyone else's supply chains. It's a trust problem with no obvious solution in a globalized, interconnected economy. Data localization and sovereignty. China's response to Aurora and similar incidents was to push for data localization, requiring that data about Chinese citizens be stored on servers physically located in China and operated by Chinese companies. Other countries have followed suit with various data sovereignty requirements. From a privacy and security perspective, this is arguably a step backward. It fragments the internet, makes cross-border services more difficult, and potentially makes data less secure rather than more, since it's now subject to authoritarian government access demands. But from a national sovereignty perspective, countries argue they have the right to control data about their citizens and ensure it's subject to their laws, not foreign jurisdiction. This tension between global interoperability and national sovereignty is one of the defining policy challenges of the internet age, and Aurora brought it into sharp relief. International norms for cyber operations. Perhaps the biggest policy implication of Aurora is the question of what rules, if any, should govern state behavior in cyberspace. Traditional warfare has international laws, the Geneva Conventions, laws of armed conflict, agreements on proportionality, and civilian protection. These rules are frequently violated, but they exist and exert some normative pressure. For cyber operations, no such framework exists. Countries can't agree on basic questions. Is peacetime cyber-espionage an act of war? When does a cyber attack justify a kinetic military response? What distinguishes legitimate intelligence gathering from economic espionage? The UN has had working groups on these questions for years, and they've made minimal progress. China and Russia push for a strong state sovereignty model where each country controls its segment of the internet. Western democracies push for a human rights-based approach that protects freedom of expression and privacy. These are fundamentally incompatible worldviews, and Operation Aurora illustrated the consequences of that incompatibility. China conducted massive cyber-espionage operations against American companies, and there was no clear international framework for responding. Some policy experts argue we need a Geneva Convention for cyberspace, international agreements that establish rules of the road for state behavior online. Others are skeptical that such agreements are achievable or enforceable given the difficulty of attribution and the fundamental differences in values between major powers. Public-private partnership models. Aurora also demonstrated that critical infrastructure and key economic assets are primarily owned and operated by private companies, not the government. Yet these companies face threats from foreign governments that they're not equipped to handle alone. This has led to various public-private partnership models where the government shares threat intelligence with companies and companies share breach information with government. But these partnerships are complicated by competing interests, trust issues, and concerns about surveillance. Companies want threat intelligence from the government, but don't want the government poking around in their networks. The government wants breach information from companies, but doesn't want to share intelligence that might reveal sources and methods. Finding the right balance remains an ongoing challenge, and one that Aurora brought to the forefront of policy discussions. One of the fascinating aspects of the Aurora case is the question of attribution. How do you conclusively prove who conducted a cyber attack? In traditional warfare, attribution is usually straightforward. If bombers with Russian markings attack your country, you know who's responsible. But in cyberspace, attribution is much more complex. Attackers can route their operations through servers in third countries, making it appear the attack is coming from somewhere else. They can use tools and techniques deliberately designed to look like they come from different adversary groups. They can steal other countries' cyber weapons and use them to create false flag operations. The Aurora attackers routed some of their traffic through Taiwan, initially suggesting Taiwanese origin. They used some techniques that were similar to Russian APT groups. A less sophisticated analysis might have attributed the attack incorrectly. But Google's forensic team, working with US intelligence agencies, was able to piece together multiple lines of evidence. Infrastructure analysis, tracing the attack infrastructure back through multiple layers of obfuscation to command and control servers located in China, specifically associated with the two universities I mentioned earlier. Timing analysis, the attacks occurred during business hours in Chinese time zones and paused during Chinese holidays. While this could be faked, it's consistent with Chinese operations. Target selection, the specific targets, both the companies hit and the specific data accessed within those companies, aligned perfectly with Chinese intelligence priorities. Tool analysis, the custom malware, while sophisticated, contains some characteristics and code structures that matched known Chinese APT tools. Linguistic artifacts, some of the code contained comments or strings in simplified Chinese characters. Intelligence context, US intelligence agencies had other, classified sources indicating Chinese government involvement. No single piece of evidence was conclusive, but collectively, they painted a clear picture of Chinese state sponsorship. This raises interesting questions about the psychology and politics of attribution. When is evidence sufficient to publicly attribute an attack? What standard of proof is required? In criminal law, we use beyond a reasonable doubt for conviction. In intelligence, analysts often use high confidence, moderate confidence, and low confidence assessments. But what standards should apply for public attribution of state-sponsored cyber attacks? The implications are significant. Publicly attributing an attack to a foreign government is a diplomatic accusation that can strain international relations. Getting it wrong could be embarrassing and counterproductive. But remaining silent might embolden attackers and suggest there are no consequences for cyber operations. Google made the decision to publicly attribute the Aurora attack to China. The US government supported this attribution. Was the evidence sufficient to justify that? In my view, yes. The combination of technical forensics, intelligence context, and circumstantial evidence made Chinese state sponsorship the only plausible explanation. But reasonable people can debate what standard of evidence should be required. This becomes even more complex when we consider that attribution is partially a social construct. The truth of who conducted an attack matters less than what key audiences believe. If Google and the US government say China did it, most people will believe that, regardless of whether they've seen the evidence. This creates opportunities for manipulation. What if a sophisticated adversary wanted to frame China for an attack they conducted? They could use Chinese tools, route traffic through Chinese infrastructure, and target objectives that align with Chinese interests. Could they successfully create a false flag operation? The answer is maybe. Attribution is ultimately a probabilistic judgment based on available evidence. It's rarely 100% certain. The Aurora attribution was strong, but not absolute. There's always some possibility of a sophisticated deception. This is why intelligence agencies are often reluctant to share their full evidence base for attribution. Revealing sources and methods could compromise future intelligence collection. But this creates a credibility problem. The public is asked to trust government assertions without seeing the evidence. It's a genuine dilemma that plays out repeatedly in cyber operations. Russia's interference in the 2016 US election, North Korea's WannaCry attack, Iran's destructive cyber operations against Saudi Arabia. In each case, attribution assessments have been controversial despite what intelligence agencies consider strong evidence. Operation Aurora was one of the first high-profile cases of public attribution, and it set a precedent for how companies and governments handle this issue. The decision to go public was consequential and required courage, but it also opened up questions about evidence, certainty, and the politics of attribution that remain unresolved. Beyond the technical details and geopolitical implications, Aurora was experienced by real people whose lives and careers were profoundly affected. Let me tell you about some of them, based on public interviews and accounts. The security engineers. Imagine being the Google security engineer who first noticed the suspicious activity. You're going about your normal work, monitoring systems, looking at logs, and you see something that makes your blood run cold. You realize a sophisticated attacker is inside your network, has been for weeks, and is targeting some of the most sensitive systems in the company. The weight of that responsibility must have been crushing. These engineers worked around the clock for weeks, tracing the attack, containing the damage, and figuring out how to prevent future breaches. They couldn't tell their families what they were working on. They couldn't ask for help outside the small circle of people with appropriate clearances. And they were up against adversaries with essentially unlimited resources and sophisticated capabilities. Several of these engineers have since spoken at security conferences about the experience. They describe it as transformative. It changed how they think about security, about threats, about the stakes of their work. Some left Google to start security companies. Others stayed and helped rebuild Google's security architecture from the ground up. The Chinese employees. Google employed hundreds of Chinese engineers, product managers, and other staff in their China offices. These were talented, hardworking people who believed in Google's mission and were proud to work there. When Google decided to pull out of China, these employees were devastated. Their jobs disappeared. Their career trajectories were disrupted. And they were caught in the middle of a geopolitical conflict they had no control over. Some transferred to Google offices in other countries, but that meant leaving their homes, families, and culture. Others joined Chinese tech companies, but with the knowledge that Google, their dream employer, had rejected the Chinese market. A few spoke publicly about feeling betrayed, caught between their loyalty to Google and their identity as Chinese citizens. There's a human cost to these corporate decisions that often gets overlooked in discussions focused on policy and strategy. The human rights activists. For the Chinese dissidents whose Gmail accounts were compromised, Aurora represented a profound violation and ongoing danger. Many of these activists have since described living with the knowledge that Chinese intelligence services read their private communications, know their contacts, and understand their activities. Some went into exile. Others changed their operational security practices dramatically. A few were arrested and imprisoned, though it's impossible to know whether Aurora intelligence played a role in their arrests. One activist who was willing to speak publicly about his experience described the psychological toll. You can never feel safe. Every email you send, every document you write, you wonder if it's being read by someone who wants to imprison you. It changes how you think, how you communicate, how you trust people. This is the real-world impact of cyber-espionage, not abstract policy debates, but human beings whose safety and freedom are compromised. The Google leadership, for Google's founders and top executives, Aurora forced them to confront fundamental questions about their values and their business. Larry Page and Sergey Brin had always positioned Google as a force for good, organizing the world's information and making it universally accessible. The "Don't be evil" motto was partly idealistic and partly pragmatic, but it reflected a genuine belief that technology companies could and should pursue moral objectives alongside business goals. Aurora forced them to ask, what are we willing to compromise for market access? At what point does operating in an authoritarian market make us complicit in oppression? Can we truly serve users in China while also serving the interests of the Chinese government? These aren't easy questions, and reasonable people can disagree on the answers. Google chose to withdraw, but other companies made different decisions, and you can't simply say one choice was right and the other wrong. What's clear is that the decision was genuinely difficult and carried significant costs, both financial and strategic. It took courage to walk away from China, and that deserves acknowledgement even if you disagree with the decision. The intelligence analysts. On the U.S. government side, the intelligence analysts and cyber operations personnel who investigated Aurora and brief policymakers also have fascinating stories, though most remain classified. From the few who have spoken publicly, usually after retiring and with appropriate clearances, we know that Aurora confirmed intelligence assessments about Chinese cyber capabilities that had been accumulating for years. The attack wasn't a surprise. It was confirmation of what analysts had been warning about. But getting policymakers to take cyber threats seriously was an uphill battle. Before Aurora, cyber attacks were often dismissed as minor nuisances or criminal matters, not national security threats. Aurora helped change that perception, but it required persistent advocacy from intelligence and cybersecurity professionals who saw the threat clearly before most others did. So what have we learned from Operation Aurora, and what challenges remain unresolved 15 years later? Lesson 1. Sophisticated nation-state attacks are an ongoing reality. Aurora demonstrated that major technology companies face adversaries with capabilities that rival or exceed their own defensive resources. This isn't going away. If anything, it's gotten worse as more nations develop offensive cyber capabilities. The implication is that companies operating critical infrastructure or handling sensitive data must assume they're being targeted by sophisticated adversaries and plan accordingly. This requires investment in security that goes beyond basic hygiene. It requires dedicated security teams, advanced detection capabilities, threat intelligence, and a security-first culture. Lesson 2. Traditional perimeter defense is insufficient. The castle and moat model of network security, building strong defenses at the perimeter and trusting everything inside, is obsolete. Aurora showed that sophisticated attackers will get inside your perimeter, and once inside, they'll exploit that trust. Modern security must assume breach and implement zero-trust principles. Verify everything, trust nothing, segment networks, enforce least privilege access, monitor continuously, and be prepared to detect and respond to attackers who are already inside your network. Lesson 3. The human element is critical. Technical defenses are necessary, but not sufficient. Employees are both the weakest link and the last line of defense. Creating a security-conscious culture where people are trained, aware, and empowered to report suspicious activity is essential. But this must be balanced with usability. If security measures are too onerous, people will find ways around them, which often creates worse security outcomes. Lesson 4. Attribution is possible but challenging. Aurora showed that attributing sophisticated cyber attacks to specific actors is possible through careful forensic analysis and intelligence integration. But it requires significant resources, expertise, and often access to classified intelligence. Companies can't usually do high-confidence attribution alone. They need to partner with government intelligence agencies and specialized security firms. And even then, attribution is probabilistic, not certain. Lesson 5. Transparency can be powerful but costly. Google's decision to go public with the Aurora attack was unprecedented and consequential. It forced a public conversation about cyber threats, changed corporate norms around breach disclosure, and put political pressure on China. But it also cost Google the Chinese market and potentially created legal and competitive risks. Companies must carefully weigh the costs and benefits of transparency in breach situations. Lesson 6. International cooperation is necessary but insufficient. Defending against nation-state threats requires information sharing between companies and governments, both domestically and internationally. Aurora catalyzed much better cooperation, but significant barriers remain. Companies are reluctant to share sensitive information. Governments have classification constraints. International cooperation is hampered by competing interests and lack of trust. And there's no enforcement mechanism for international cyber norms. We've made progress, but we're nowhere near having an effective international framework for cybersecurity. Remaining challenges. Despite the lessons learned, major challenges remain. The attribution problem. While possible, attribution remains difficult and contested. Adversaries are getting better at obfuscation and false flag operations. How do we maintain high-confidence attribution in an environment where deception is sophisticated and consequences are high? The deterrence problem. How do you deter cyber attacks when adversaries don't fear the consequences? Traditional deterrence relies on credible threats of punishment. But in cyberspace, the calculus is different. The potential gains from successful espionage are huge. The costs of failure are low, especially if you can maintain plausible deniability, and kinetic retaliation to cyber attacks risks escalation. The public-private problem. Critical infrastructure and key economic assets are privately owned, but face threats from foreign governments. How do you build effective defense when the targets are private companies, but the attackers are state actors? Public-private partnerships help, but they're complicated by competing interests and trust issues. The arms race problem. Every defensive innovation spurs offensive innovation. Zero-day exploits become more sophisticated. Encryption leads to better encryption breaking techniques. Detection systems lead to better evasion techniques. How do you stay ahead in an arms race where your adversaries have unlimited resources and patience? The values problem. Different societies have fundamentally different values around privacy, security, freedom of expression, and state control. China's vision of cyber sovereignty is incompatible with Western visions of an open internet. How do you reconcile these competing visions in a globally connected network? The speed problem. Technology evolves faster than policy, law, and international norms. By the time we've figured out how to address one generation of threats, the threat landscape has evolved. How do we create governance frameworks that are flexible enough to keep pace with technological change? These are not merely academic questions. They're practical challenges that security professionals, policymakers, and technology leaders grapple with every day. And 15 years after Aurora, we still don't have good answers. Looking ahead, what does the future hold for cyber conflict, and how might lessons from Aurora inform that future? Escalating sophistication. The trend since Aurora has been toward increasingly sophisticated attacks. Nation-state actors are developing better tools, better operational security, and better understanding of target environments. We're seeing AI and machine learning integrated into both offensive and defensive security. Attackers can use AI to automate reconnaissance, identify vulnerabilities, and even generate polymorphic malware that constantly changes to evade detection. Defenders use AI for anomaly detection, threat hunting, and automated response. The Aurora attackers spent weeks or months manually navigating Google's network. Future attackers will use AI systems that can autonomously map networks, identify valuable targets, and exfiltrate data at machine speed. This raises a troubling prospect: fully automated cyber weapons that can spread, adapt, and cause damage without human intervention. We've already seen glimpses of this with worms like Stuxnet, which reportedly targeted Iranian nuclear facilities, and NotPetya, which caused billions in damage worldwide. Future conflicts might involve AI-driven cyber weapons that are faster and more destructive than humans can effectively manage. The ransomware problem. Since Aurora, we've seen the explosion of ransomware attacks that encrypt victim data and demand payment for decryption keys. Initially a criminal enterprise, ransomware has evolved into something more concerning. We now see state-sponsored ransomware attacks that blur the line between criminal activity and cyber warfare. Russian-linked groups attacked Ukrainian infrastructure. North Korean groups have conducted ransomware attacks to raise funds for their weapons programs. Iranian groups have hit Saudi and Israeli targets. This creates a dangerous ambiguity. Is a ransomware attack a criminal act or an act of war? How should nations respond? The traditional rules of armed conflict don't clearly apply, and ransomware has become more dangerous as attackers target not just data availability through encryption, but also data confidentiality by stealing data and threatening to publish it if ransom isn't paid. Healthcare systems, critical infrastructure, and government agencies have all been severely disrupted by ransomware attacks. The IoT and supply chain vulnerabilities. The proliferation of Internet of Things, IoT, devices, everything from security cameras to industrial control systems to medical devices, creates massive new attack surfaces. Many of these devices have poor security, can't be easily updated, and are connected to critical networks. We've already seen large-scale IoT botnet attacks like Mirai, which compromised hundreds of thousands of devices and used them to conduct massive distributed denial-of-service attacks. Future attacks might target industrial control systems at power plants, water treatment facilities, or transportation infrastructure with potentially catastrophic physical consequences. Supply chain attacks have also become more prominent. Instead of directly attacking a hardened target, adversaries compromise suppliers or service providers. The SolarWinds attack in 2020 compromised software used by thousands of organizations, including multiple U.S. government agencies, by compromising the software vendor's build system. This echoes Aurora's targeting of technology companies, but with even broader implications. If attackers can compromise the supply chain, they can potentially access thousands of downstream targets through a single breach. The quantum threat. Looking further ahead, quantum computing poses both opportunities and threats for cybersecurity. On the threat side, sufficiently powerful quantum computers could break current encryption algorithms, potentially rendering much of our current security infrastructure obsolete. Adversaries are already conducting harvest now, decrypt later attacks, stealing encrypted data today with the intention of decrypting it once quantum computers become powerful enough. Any sensitive information with long-term value is potentially vulnerable. The cybersecurity community is working on post-quantum encryption algorithms designed to resist quantum attacks, but transitioning the entire internet to new encryption standards is a massive undertaking that will take years or decades. The deepfake and disinformation problem. While Aurora was focused on espionage and data theft, future conflicts will increasingly involve information manipulation. Deepfake technology, AI-generated fake videos, audio, and images, is becoming increasingly sophisticated and difficult to detect. Imagine a future scenario where attackers don't just steal information, but manipulate it. They alter financial records, forge executive communications, or create fake evidence of crimes or misconduct. The damage from such attacks could be devastating and difficult to prove or correct. We're already seeing sophisticated disinformation campaigns that blend hacking, leaks, and manipulation to influence elections, sow discord, and undermine trust in institutions. Russia's interference in the 2016 U.S. election combined traditional intelligence operations with social media manipulation in ways that were deeply concerning. Future campaigns will likely be even more sophisticated, potentially combining real leaked information with subtle manipulations, making it impossible for the public to distinguish truth from fiction. The cyber conflict escalation problem. Perhaps the most concerning future scenario is the uncontrolled escalation of cyber conflicts into kinetic warfare. So far, cyber attacks have largely remained in the cyber domain. Even serious attacks like Aurora or Russia's destructive attacks on Ukraine's power grid or the Stuxnet attack on Iranian nuclear facilities haven't directly triggered military responses. But there's no clear red line for when cyber attacks justify kinetic retaliation. If a cyber attack destroys critical infrastructure and causes casualties, say, by shutting down a hospital's systems or causing a train derailment, does that justify a military response? How do you calibrate proportionate responses when the domains of conflict are so different? The risk is that a miscalculation or accident could lead to escalation that neither side intended. One nation conducts a cyber attack they view as limited espionage. The target perceives it as an act of war and responds militarily. Suddenly, we're in a shooting war that started with computer code. This is made worse by the attribution problem. If you can't be certain who attacked you, how do you know who to retaliate against? What if attribution is wrong and you strike the wrong country? These are not theoretical concerns. We're in an era where major powers are developing extensive offensive cyber capabilities, demonstrating willingness to use them, and struggling to establish norms and agreements that might prevent escalation. The need for new frameworks. Aurora exposed the inadequacy of existing frameworks for understanding and responding to cyber threats. 15 years later, we still haven't developed adequate replacements. We need new international agreements on cyber norms, but agreement seems far off given fundamental differences in values and interests between major powers. We need better attribution capabilities and processes, but this requires unprecedented information sharing and cooperation that many nations resist. We need better defensive technologies and practices, but we're in an arms race where adversaries constantly adapt. We need better governance of the zero-day market and surveillance technology trade, but market forces and national security interests push against regulation. Most fundamentally, we need a social and political understanding that cybersecurity is not merely a technical problem, but a strategic challenge that touches on everything from human rights to national security to economic competitiveness. Operation Aurora was a wake-up call. The question is whether we've truly woken up or just hit snooze. Let's bring this back to the human level by examining what happened to some of the key figures involved in the Aurora story. Sergey Brin, Google's co-founder, was reportedly the most personally invested in the decision to pull out of China. Having fled the Soviet Union as a child, he had direct experience with authoritarian government surveillance and oppression. After Aurora, Brin became even more vocal about concerns regarding government surveillance and internet freedom. He's spoken publicly about Aurora as a defining moment that crystallized Google's thinking about operating in authoritarian markets. Brin stepped back from day-to-day operations at Google in 2015 when the company reorganized into Alphabet, but he remained on the board until 2019. The Aurora decision remains one of his most consequential and controversial legacies. Eric Schmidt, as Google's CEO during Aurora, Schmidt was responsible for navigating the company through the crisis. He supported the decision to go public and withdraw from China, though he's also acknowledged the business costs were significant. After leaving Google, Schmidt became chairman of the Defense Innovation Board, advising the Pentagon on technology issues, and later chaired the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. His experience with Aurora clearly shaped his thinking about cybersecurity and technological competition with China. Schmidt has since written and spoken extensively about the need for U.S. technological leadership and the strategic challenge posed by China. The Aurora experience seems to have politicized him in ways that might not have happened otherwise. The Aurora victims, for the human rights activists whose accounts were compromised, the aftermath has been varied and often tragic. Some went into exile, continuing their activism from safer locations. Others remained in China, accepting the risks. A few were arrested and imprisoned, though proving direct links to Aurora intelligence is impossible. What's clear is that Aurora had a chilling effect on Chinese dissent. Activists realized that even using American technology platforms didn't protect them from Chinese government surveillance. This pushed some toward more extreme operational security measures, using only air-gapped devices, avoiding electronic communication, meeting only in person. But such measures also limit the effectiveness of activism in a digital age. The security professionals, many of the Google security engineers and analysts who worked on the Aurora response, went on to distinguished careers in cybersecurity. Some stayed at Google, helping build the company's world-class security program. Others left to found security startups or join other major tech companies. A few went to work for government agencies or intelligence services. In interviews and conference talks, many describe Aurora as the most consequential incident of their careers. It was the moment they realized cybersecurity wasn't just about protecting data. It was about protecting people and defending against nation-state threats to democracy and human rights. The Chinese government officials. On the Chinese side, while we don't have detailed information about specific individuals involved in Aurora, the broader Chinese cyber program has continued to expand. The People's Liberation Army has established dedicated cyber warfare units. Chinese intelligence services have become more sophisticated in their operations. The Great Firewall has become more advanced and effective at controlling information. From the Chinese government's perspective, Aurora might be viewed as a successful operation that achieved intelligence objectives while also driving a major American competitor out of the Chinese market. The costs, diplomatic tension, increased scrutiny of Chinese cyber operations were apparently acceptable relative to the gains. The policymakers, for U.S. government officials working on cybersecurity issues, Aurora was a catalytic event that enabled policy changes that had been difficult before. Increased funding for cyber defense, new authorities for offensive cyber operations, sanctions on Chinese military units and intelligence officers, all became politically feasible after Aurora demonstrated the severity of the threat. Some officials have since expressed frustration that even with increased attention and resources, the fundamental problem hasn't been solved. Chinese cyber-espionage continues. Intellectual property theft continues. The strategic challenge of balancing cooperation and competition with China in technology domains remains unresolved. Operation Aurora sits at the intersection of three powerful forces: technological change, geopolitical competition, and conflicting values. Understanding this intersection is crucial to understanding both Aurora's significance and the challenges we face going forward. Technology as a domain of power. Throughout history, technological advantage has been a key determinant of power. Naval technology enabled colonial empires. Industrial technology powered military strength. Nuclear technology shaped the Cold War balance of power. In the 21st century, digital technology has become the key domain of power competition. Whoever leads in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced semiconductors, biotechnology, and related fields will have enormous economic, military, and geopolitical advantages. Aurora was, in part, an operation to steal that technological advantage. By penetrating American technology companies and defense contractors, Chinese intelligence sought to leapfrog years of research and development, accelerating China's technological rise. This is not unique to China. Every major power engages in some form of technology espionage. The US certainly does. The difference is one of scale and methods. Chinese cyber-espionage has been described as vacuuming up massive amounts of intellectual property across entire industries, a systematic, government-directed campaign to acquire foreign technology. The question this raises is, how do you maintain technological leadership in a world where adversaries can steal your innovations faster than you can develop them? Traditional intellectual property protections don't work well when the thief is a foreign government operating in cyberspace. Some argue for technological decoupling, limiting Chinese access to American technology and American access to Chinese markets. This is essentially what happened with Google post-Aurora, and it's been extended to other domains like semiconductors, 5G networks, and artificial intelligence. But decoupling has costs. It fragments the global economy, reduces efficiency, and potentially slows innovation by limiting international collaboration. It also might not be effective. Determined adversaries can often find ways around controls through third countries or front companies. Others argue for a strategy of innovation supremacy, staying ahead through faster innovation rather than trying to prevent theft. If you're constantly pushing the frontier, stolen technology is already obsolete by the time adversaries can exploit it. But this requires sustained investment, a robust research ecosystem, and a pipeline of talent, all of which are themselves targets of competitor nations. Geopolitical competition. Aurora must be understood in the context of US-China rivalry, which is increasingly characterized as the defining geopolitical competition of the 21st century. China has risen rapidly over the past few decades, becoming the world's second-largest economy and a peer competitor to the US in many domains. Chinese leadership has stated ambitious goals to become the global leader in technology and to surpass the US economically and militarily. From the US perspective, this represents a challenge to American primacy and the liberal international order that has prevailed since World War II. From China's perspective, this is simply their rightful place in the world after centuries of humiliation by Western powers. Cyber operations like Aurora are tools in this broader competition. They advance Chinese interests by stealing technology, gathering intelligence, and potentially preparing the battlefield for future conflicts. The US response has been inconsistent, sometimes accommodating Chinese rise as inevitable and potentially beneficial, sometimes viewing it as a threat requiring containment. The Obama administration tried engagement while also pushing back on unfair trade practices and cyber-espionage. The Trump administration took a more confrontational approach with trade wars and technology restrictions. The Biden administration has continued many Trump-era policies while trying to establish guardrails to prevent uncontrolled escalation. What's clear is that cyber operations have become a key domain of US-China competition alongside trade, military posture, influence in developing countries and international institutions. Aurora was an early skirmish in what has become an ongoing cyber conflict. It's a conflict that happens largely in secret, with most operations never publicly acknowledged. But it's real, it's consequential, and it's unlikely to end anytime soon. Values conflicts. Perhaps most fundamentally, Aurora exposed deep conflicts in values between democratic and authoritarian approaches to technology. The Western democratic model emphasizes individual rights, privacy, freedom of expression, and limits on government power. The internet is viewed as a liberating technology that empowers individuals and enables free exchange of ideas. The Chinese authoritarian model emphasizes state control, collective interest over individual rights, and the internet as a tool for government surveillance and social management. From this perspective, Western concepts of internet freedom are threats to stability and vehicles for foreign interference. These are not merely abstract philosophical differences. They have concrete implications for how technology is built and governed. When Google built lawful intercept capabilities to comply with U.S. law, those capabilities were designed with legal and procedural safeguards, warrants, judicial oversight, limits on scope. The Chinese government had no such constraints and simply exploited those capabilities for intelligence gathering against dissidents. This illustrates a fundamental asymmetry. Democratic systems build in protections and constraints that authoritarian systems can exploit as vulnerabilities. Similarly, democratic societies struggle with questions about encryption, surveillance, and privacy in ways that authoritarian societies don't. China doesn't debate whether the government should have backdoors into communications. It's simply assumed that the state has the right to monitor everything. This creates competitive disadvantages for democracies in some domains. Authoritarian states can mobilize resources, make decisions quickly, and take actions that would be politically impossible in democracies. They're not constrained by privacy concerns, public opinion, or judicial oversight. But democratic systems have advantages too. Innovation tends to thrive in open societies with strong protections for intellectual property and individual rights. The world's leading technology companies are overwhelmingly from democratic countries. Authoritarian control tends to stifle the kind of creative thinking and risk-taking that drives technological breakthroughs. The question is whether these democratic advantages can be sustained in the face of determined authoritarian competition. Can you maintain technological leadership while also respecting individual rights? Can you build secure systems without authoritarian surveillance? Can you compete effectively with adversaries who don't play by the same rules? Operation Aurora forced these questions into the open. Google's decision to withdraw from China was ultimately a statement of values, a decision that democratic principles and human rights mattered more than market access and profit. Whether other companies and countries will make similar choices or whether commercial interests will prevail over values remains an open question. So here we are, 15 years after Operation Aurora, looking back at an incident that changed the technology industry, exposed the reality of cyber warfare, and forced difficult questions about how democracies should engage with authoritarian rivals. What did we learn? What's changed? And what does the future hold? The enduring lessons. First, Aurora taught us that sophisticated nation-state cyber attacks are not theoretical threats. They're an ongoing reality. Every major organization faces adversaries with capabilities that rival or exceed their defensive resources. This requires a fundamental rethinking of security from perimeter defense to zero-trust architecture, from reactive to proactive defense, from isolated company efforts to collective defense through information sharing. Second, Aurora demonstrated that cybersecurity is not merely a technical problem, but a human, organizational, and strategic challenge. Technical defenses are necessary, but not sufficient. You need a security-conscious culture, trained personnel, strong leadership commitment, and resilience in the face of inevitable breaches. Third, Aurora showed that transparency and public attribution of cyber attacks, while costly and challenging, can be powerful tools for accountability and norm setting. Google's decision to go public changed corporate and government practices around breach disclosure and attribution. Fourth, Aurora exposed deep tensions between commercial interests and values, between engagement and withdrawal, between cooperation and competition. These tensions haven't been resolved. They've, if anything, become more acute as technology becomes more central to geopolitics. What's changed? The cybersecurity landscape has evolved dramatically since Aurora. Security practices are far more sophisticated, with zero-trust principles, AI-driven detection, and enhanced collaboration being standard practice at major organizations. Attribution capabilities have improved through better forensics, intelligence sharing, and international cooperation. Policy responses have become more robust, with sanctions, indictments, and diplomatic pressure being routine tools. Public awareness is much higher. People understand that cyber threats are real and consequential. Investment in security has increased massively, both in the private sector and government. But fundamental problems remain. Nation-state cyber-espionage continues at scale. Intellectual property theft remains a massive economic problem. Critical infrastructure remains vulnerable. International norms are weak and poorly enforced. The zero-day market continues to create perverse incentives. Attribution remains challenging and contested. Deterrence doesn't work well in cyber domains. The bigger picture: Aurora needs to be understood not as an isolated incident, but as a window into the future of conflict, competition, and cooperation in a digitally connected world. We're in an era where cyberspace has become a domain of power competition alongside land, sea, air, and space. Where information is a strategic asset worth stealing. Where technology leadership is a key determinant of national power. Where authoritarian and democratic systems compete for global influence through digital means. Aurora was an early battle in this ongoing competition. Google's response, withdrawing from China, investing in security, advocating for internet freedom, represented a choice to prioritize values over commercial interests. Not every company has made the same choice. Many continue to operate in China, making accommodations and compromises. This isn't necessarily wrong. Reasonable people can disagree about whether engagement or withdrawal is more likely to promote positive change. But what's undeniable is that these choices matter. They have consequences for human rights, for technological development, for the future of the internet, and for the broader geopolitical competition between democratic and authoritarian systems. The unfinished story. Operation Aurora's story isn't finished. The issues it exposed remain unresolved. How should technology companies balance commercial interests against human rights and values? How can democracies maintain technological leadership while respecting individual rights and privacy? How can we establish effective international norms for state behavior in cyberspace? How can we build systems that are secure against nation-state threats while remaining open and accessible? How can we deter cyber attacks when adversaries don't fear the consequences? These questions don't have easy answers. They require ongoing dialogue, difficult choices, and sustained commitment. The human element. Throughout this story, I've tried to emphasize the human dimension. The security engineers working around the clock to defend their company, the activists whose communications were compromised and lives endangered, the employees whose jobs were eliminated, the executives facing impossible choices. Behind every cyber attack are real people affected by real consequences. It's easy to get lost in technical details or geopolitical abstractions, But we should never forget that cybersecurity is ultimately about protecting human beings, their privacy, their safety, their freedom, their rights. The Aurora attackers weren't just stealing data. They were hunting dissidents whose crime was advocating for human rights and democracy. Google's response wasn't just about protecting intellectual property. It was about refusing to be complicit in oppression. These human dimensions should inform how we think about cybersecurity policy and practice. Technical solutions and strategic planning are important, but they should serve humanistic goals. A call to awareness. If you take nothing else from this story, understand this. Operation Aurora wasn't an anomaly. It was a glimpse of the ongoing reality of cyber conflict. Right now, as you watch this, there are nation-state hackers probing networks, stealing data, and preparing for future conflicts. There are activists whose communications are being monitored by authoritarian governments. There are companies facing sophisticated attacks. There are intelligence agencies conducting operations against adversaries. This isn't science fiction or theoretical risk. It's happening continuously, mostly in secret, with enormous consequences. As citizens, consumers, and users of technology, we should care about this. We should demand that our governments take cyber threats seriously and respond effectively. We should expect companies to prioritize security and transparency. We should support strong encryption and privacy protections. We should be aware of the risks and take reasonable precautions. But we should also recognize that individual action isn't sufficient. These are systemic challenges requiring collective responses. We need better laws, better international agreements, better industry practices, and better political leadership on these issues. Final thoughts. Operation Aurora was a turning point. The moment when cyber warfare moved from the shadows into public consciousness, when a major technology company chose values over profit, when the scale and sophistication of nation-state threats became undeniable. The decisions made in response to Aurora, by Google, by the US government, by other companies and countries, have shaped the world we live in today. The ongoing consequences of those decisions will shape the world of tomorrow. We live in an age where code can be more powerful than weapons, where information is a strategic resource, where the internet is simultaneously a tool for liberation and oppression. How we navigate these tensions and contradictions will determine not just the future of technology, but the future of human freedom and flourishing. Operation Aurora showed us what's at stake. The question is, what will we do about it? The hack that forced Google out of China wasn't just about technology. It was about power, values, and the future of the internet itself. It was about whether a democratic company could operate in an authoritarian market without becoming complicit in oppression. It was about whether cyber warfare would remain in the shadows or be brought into the light. Google chose transparency over secrecy, values over profit, and withdrew from the world's largest market. That decision cost them billions, but set a precedent that still matters today. The Aurora attackers accomplished their immediate mission. They gathered intelligence on Chinese dissidents and stole valuable technology. But they also triggered a response that made cybersecurity a global priority, improved defenses across industries, and exposed the reality of state-sponsored cyber warfare. 15 years later, the conflict continues. The stakes are higher. The attacks are more sophisticated. And the fundamental questions Aurora raised remain unanswered. But at least now we're asking the questions. At least now we understand what we're facing. And that awareness, uncomfortable as it is the first step toward building a more secure digital future. If this story resonated with you, if you learned something, if you're thinking differently about cybersecurity and technology, hit that subscribe button. We dig deep into the stories behind the headlines, the hacks, the decisions, the people, and the implications that matter. The next cyber attack is already in progress somewhere. The next difficult choice is being made by some executive team right now. The next chapter of this story is being written as we speak, and you'll want to be here when we tell it. Thanks for watching.